Hey everybody, it's Perrott, founder of the Ladies Working Dog Group. Are you feeling stuck with your Gundog training? Trust me, you're not alone, and that's exactly why you need to be here. Every week, we're bringing you the best tips and hacks to make training your Gundog easy peasy. We'll keep it straightforward, no fuss, just actionable guidance that you can put straight to use. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Found It, Fetched It. This week, I'm going to be talking about how to navigate when your dog's behaviour feels out of control. How are we this week, Claire?
I'm very well, Jo. How are you?
I'm feeling good, and I think this is a that everybody will be able to relate to a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about where does the sign start that we are missing dog's behaviour that's going to lead to this feeling in the end of being overwhelmed?
Yeah, this is where very often the owner of the dog won't actually realise that there is a problem until the problem becomes a problem to them. So what I mean by that is the dog may have been regressing in certain areas in the home, in the garden, way before the thing that the owner deems a problem happens. So a good example of that would be recall. So a lot of the times when I'm contacted about dogs with recall problems, the owner gets in touch when something bad has happened. Perhaps the dog has chased wildlife or has run out of the house into the road, or the dog has ran up to another person or dog and got itself into trouble. And that's, for the owner, the moment when they realise they have a recall issue. However, in 99.9%, probably 99.999% of the time, actually, the recall has been breaking down for much longer. It's just that these were tiny little nuances, little signs that perhaps the owner overlooked. So perhaps it is that the dog had ignored the recall in the garden, and the handler or owner, instead of doing something about it and going out and getting the dog, thought the dog's in the garden, so it's safe. I'll just go in and he'll come in when he's ready, without realizing that these little things that are happening in the home and the garden are actually what contribute to that end result where the owner really thinks, oh no, I have a problem.
So reflecting on your expertise, what are some of the sort of insights you wish dog owners knew? Because if it's your first dog, you don't know what you don't know. We say this all the time. So what are some of the first sort of insights you wish they knew earlier about dogs' behaviour?
Yeah, okay. So the first thing is always be very mindful and considerate to, are you in a learning phase with the dog? So are you teaching the dog something? Or are you in a proofing stage with the dog? So are you proofing something that you've taught? Or are you at the point where it's a trained response? And so the dog has learnt it and it's been proofed in various scenarios, circumstances, and environments. So knowing those things is really important in the beginning. If you're working with a dog who's learning, then it's really important that the owner is setting the dog up for success as much as possible. If you're in the proofing stage, it's important to build up the 3Ds are a good example of that. So the distance, the duration, and the distraction level, build them up through the proofing phase. And still you want to a point, be setting your dog up for success, even though you are stretching the dog a little bit. But when you've got to a trained response, when the dog knows the thing, they know the cue or the command or the exercise, and it's been proofed, but they're failing to do it, it's then being able to unpick and say, what were the signs that this was happening before it all went really wrong? If, for instance, in the house, you are asking your dog to do something and the dog doesn't do it, you need to be following through to ensure the dog does do it. Otherwise, don't ask the dog to do it. So an example of that might be if, for instance, you were cooking and you wanted the dog to sit on their bed whilst you were cooking, and you're treating that as a stay with distractions. Okay, let's just say you've put your dog there, you've asked them to stay, and you're treating this as a stay with distractions, and your dog keeps getting up. You have to put the dog back. Okay, you have to be consistent in the message you're giving the dog. If the dog just gets up and wanders off during that, the dog is learning that they can ignore that stay command or cue, and that they can get up and wander off. And then the owner might not realize that little thing, that little behavior in the home has crept into their, let's say, formal Gundog training, and the dog is no longer sitting steady while exciting things are happening around them. But actually the dog learned in the house that actually when you asked it to stay there, you didn't mean it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's easily done. In fact, for example, you could be cooking, asking for a stay, they wander into the living room and you think, oh, it doesn't matter, they're out of the way anyway. And it's more of an oversight rather than you undoing your training on purpose. Or, for example, a lot of people are confused. Do I lure them back with a bit of what I'm cooking, get them to sit back again? How do I make or enforce that I asked for a stay?
Absolutely, because this goes back to other podcasts that we've talked about, patterns of behavior. I really loved that podcast because it gave people insight in how the dogs form patterns of behavior. And sometimes without realizing it, we're creating a pattern of behavior that we don't want. So what you just said there, should they lure the dog back with a treat? Actually, what's the dog learning in that moment? The dog might be learning, she asks me to sit and stay here because she's off doing that. But if I get up and wander off, she goes and gets something really tasty and lures me back to the bed, and I get a little reward for doing that. Actually, the dog starts to believe, if I want something now, all I have to do is break the stay and she'll lure me back, because then she'll give me a treat and I get that food for free. So the dog is actually then being rewarded for getting up. You're not teaching the dog what you want in that moment. The dog is learning a pattern of behavior that goes against what you're trying to teach.
And these are like simple examples, and I'm sure loads of listeners are like, oh my God, I do this all the time. And we feel really bad, but they are so easy to do and so difficult to even recognize sometimes that we're doing them.
100%. Listen, I've got 4 dogs in the home now. Puppy that I'm training, she just turned 5-year-old Labrador who is in the trained response for most things, and then 2 elderly dogs who seem to starting to think that the rules don't apply to them anymore because they're older, and one's going deaf, has dementia, and is going blind, and the other one, he just thinks they're busy teaching the puppies and no one's going to notice if I do this. So being consistent with multi-dogs is really important, because you might be putting so much emphasis on that puppy getting it right that you're forgetting what the other dogs are doing. And then before you know it, those older dogs have got bad habits forming. And then you take them out on the field and things start to go wrong. And you're like, oh, I haven't been putting the work in. The dog's been getting away with that at home. And I've been so focused on the puppy that I didn't think about it.
I've told some of our members this story before, but we used to have a Jack Russell and his name was Piggy. He had little black eyes and he was near enough completely white. And there was no dogs in the house rule, like flat out with my dad, no dogs in the house. But Piggy would come in when people were chatting and he would creep along the side of the wall literally against the tongue groove. And my father would say, stop talking to us all. And the dog would freeze, like his leg could be in the air, and he'd freeze and he would not make eye contact with that table. So Dad would say, start talking. We'd all start talking, and he'd creep in. He would use the conversations around the table as his distraction to get in front of the fire. If Dad was in a good mood, Dad would laugh and Piggy would make it to the fire. If Dad was in the animals outside, or my wife was napped me off mood, it would be like, Piggy, out. And he'd turn around and go out. But then he'd start it again. And now listening and talking to you, it's like, that was almost, it wasn't a game to him because he wanted to get in front of the fire, but it was almost a pattern of behavior. He knew he was going to succeed sometimes, so it was worth keeping on doing it, wasn't it?
Absolutely, 100%. Dude got into a little bit of a habit of, he would lay on his bed perfectly. This is funny. lay on his bed perfectly while you're cooking the dinner. You'd be eating your dinner. You'd be engaged in conversation, be completely unaware that he had left the room. He wasn't under the table begging, but he'd left the room. He didn't want to be there anymore. And then when he heard the knives and forks being put back down on the plate, he would sneak back in and lay on his bed as if he hadn't moved at all. And we had to actually think about this and go, do we need to correct that? Because what we actually realized was, dude is such a foodie. He took himself away to avoid the temptation. And then he came back in and put himself on the bed when he heard us finishing. So he's like, thank God they finished. I can go back in now. I'm not going to get this wrong. And that's where you then have to pick your battles, because you go, okay, so am I going to allow that to happen? Could that seep into any other areas of my training? And that's the thought process you've got to have. Could this that I'm allowing in the home seep into any other behaviours when I'm training on the field and create me an issue? And I think that's where a little bit of due diligence on your part of, does this matter? Is it going to create me another problem? And then picking your battles, because if it's not going to create you a problem and you don't mind, then that's fine. But if it is going to create you a problem, then you need to change something.
Yeah, and the chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you are training your dog to do something. So those are really relevant questions. And along with the questions that I can always remember Rob Lane saying to me, and you've discussed, and we discussed it with the members, does it matter where your dog lies down? If you've got this settle command, which means settle anywhere, does it matter if they're on the rug or on their bed? Or is there a stay in this one place, then how does that matter? But you're absolutely right. It's setting each day out with an intention, isn't it?
It is. It's setting each day out with an intention, and also setting your dog up for success as much as you possibly can. And always just being mindful it is so important to be mindful as to whether your dog is in the learning phase, in which case you can't be complacent with anything. The dog's in the learning phase. You've got to be on the ball when the dog is in that phase. The proofing phase, so you might go, today I'm going to take this sit or this stay, and I'm going to take it to an environment where there's more distractions. You don't want to be doing that if your dog can't do it in a low distracting place. So during the proofing phase, you've got to be mindful that you're not going to undo a lot of the good work that you've put in during the training learning phase for the dog. And then once it is a trained thing, you're actually proofing it for life, because every time you then go and do it somewhere else, that's then testing that thing under a different circumstance. And so the learning never stops. It never stops.
Yeah, because even if you think of an environment that you've been in 1,000 times, it still changes when it could be what season of the year it is, what animals are around, what people are around. And we've always got to stay on the ball. There's always things going on that we are not seeing or we are not aware of. This keeps on going back down to our awareness of our situation.
This is where reading your dog's body language is really super important, because if you think about it, for the dogs, they are smelling things that we're not even aware of. They're picking up on what other dogs have been through that area, what wildlife has been through that area, the scent on the ground, the scent in the air. They're picking up on things that we are not aware of. So we're aware of so many minuscule things compared to the dog. Compared to the dog, we're aware of, oh, there's a car just gone past. Oh, that dog was aware of that car coming a long time before we were. Their hearing is better than us. They would have picked up scent. So the dogs are aware far before us. And so it's down to us to read the dog's body language to see if the dog is picking up on something. So a good example of that would be with a young dog, a novice dog that I'm maybe trying to create a really solid stay, because I'm doing steadiness training. I'll be watching the dog's body language. And if I can see the dog's nose start to twitch, its head start to move, I'm doing things with my head that nobody can see because it's a podcast. But the dog's nose is starting to twitch, the head is moving around, you can see the tail starting to move. For me, that would be the moment where I'm going to return to the dog and praise them and release them before they make a mistake. So I've got to read the body language to be aware of what's going on in the environment, in the atmosphere, that might be affecting the dog's performance that I'm not aware of. So we're reliant on watching the body language to do that.
And within our masterclass with the membership, we go in depth on how to read that body language.
Yeah.
But for people who are like listening on here and they've maybe not watched that yet, or they don't have access to that at the moment, what sort of proactive steps do you suggest for owners to address the behavioural issues once they've acknowledged their role? So if you listen to this, you go, okay, I'm going to start being a little bit more serious now. It doesn't need to suddenly become, you don't have to become like a dictator with your dog, do you? You need to just reinforce.
Yeah, absolutely. It's consistency. We talk about it all the time. It's consistency in the messages we're giving the dog, the training we're giving the dog. So if something has gone wrong, let's just use recall as an example of that because it's such a common one. Let's just say you've had a one-off recall disaster. That could have been a one-off. That could have been a one-off, but goes back to something that I always like to say to my clients. If something goes wrong twice, you need to change something on the third time to get it right. Or if something happens twice that you don't like, you're going to have to be mindful that it doesn't happen a third time. The more times a dog performs a behavior or an action, the more that is likely to become a habit. If your dog has failed to recall in one area twice, I would definitely be putting some management in place for that. I would be putting a long line on the dog or keeping the dog on a lead, and I would be doing obedience in that area to ensure that my dog is listening to me. But alongside that, I'd be thinking to myself, okay, is there anything going on in the home that is contributing to this? Or is this environmental? Is it something to do with what the dog is picking up on? Have I proofed my recall training enough for this environment? So it's analysing everything and deciding whether you have trained it enough for that environment, whether you need to go back a step in the training to make sure you get that solid, or is it a case that in the home your dog has been learning to ignore you, or in the garden your dog, and so it's just filtering through. So it's being mindful, but if it's happened twice, you've got to stop it happening a third time. Otherwise, you're starting to get a habit forming there that you don't want.
I know there's probably lots of listeners thinking, oh my God, this is all my fault, or feelings of guilt. We talk about it quite a lot. It's people take all the onus on themselves. I have ruined my dog type of thing. How can we guide owners to realize it's just part of the process?
So dogs are another species, and I think we have to remember this. People humanize dogs too much and they expect them to behave like a human would. But because if you think about it, the things we've just spoken about, the fact that they can smell things that we can't smell, they can hear things way further away than we can hear them. They're contending with a lot more than what we realize they're contending with. So you can't be blaming yourself. It's just being mindful. And if it has gone wrong, then just analyze where that's gone wrong. And that's the point to then go, okay, how can I stop it going wrong again? And how can I start to remedy this? But it's not worth beating yourself up about or feeling guilty about, because we're working with another species. And so they will do things from time to time that maybe surprise us or catch us off guard, because there's things going on in their heads and in their world that we're not aware of.
When I wrote my book, you've written books as well. I had a set amount of words, and then the final draft was like 16,000 words over, right? And I was like, oh God, that's a lot. And then I thought, but the reality is you could talk about this in depth all the time. People have to stop taking the blame, because if I look at our organization as a whole, the people who fail, shall we say, they don't fail, or the people who struggle the most and spend the most time struggling with their dog are the ones who feel incredible guilt for everything that's going wrong with the dog. They are the people who suffer the most. We see it all the time, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is as well, okay, so there might be things going wrong. That's training. That is training for you. If everything went perfect, everything's learned. So if the dog is making mistakes, you're still in training. You're still in training. And even when the dog is trained, they will occasionally make mistakes. And we as humans will also make mistakes. And that's okay. We're not perfect, and the dogs won't be perfect either. And I think it's just taking a bit of a breather and not being so hard on yourself, and also appreciating the things that are going right in a training session. Let's just say you did a 30-minute training session with your dog, and your dog did 8 stunning retrieves, okay? But then something that distracted the dog, and the dog ran off and ignored the recall. Most people get so hung up on that one thing that went wrong that they suddenly forget all of the bits that have gone right. But for me, it's if something goes wrong, you've then got to reset, and you've got to then set the dog up for success the next time so that they don't repeat that. And that's part of the learning process. That's then the dog learning that thing you just did. You can't do that. This is how we do it, remember? But you do it in such a way that you help the dog get it right so that you can reward the dog, because we know that when we reward the dog, we will get more of that stuff happen. So it's really important you don't just get hung up on the odd thing that goes wrong in your training.
And we know as well, don't we? There are dogs where new owners, as they learn, the dog learns alongside them. And yes, they have blips, but everybody learns together. But then you have owners where the reality of it being is, through no fault of their own, they've just ended up with a dog that can be incredibly hard to teach, can't they?
Absolutely. The thing is, every dog is different. We say this every time. Work with the dog in front of you. Every dog is different. And I think you can really struggle to not compare what you're doing with your dog with what somebody else is doing with their dogs. We all go through that, and especially with dogs' ages, people are like, what should my dog be doing at this age? And that's irrelevant, really, because it depends on how quickly your dog is absorbing the information, how quickly your dog is able to then do that behavior in different environments, and how long that proofing takes you, your capability of a handler, your time, how much time that you have to give to the training. And that doesn't mean that the more time you give, the better. That's not always the case, but time will make a difference. And I think every dog is just so unique, and you come across pitfalls in your training. You absolutely do. Rose was so easy to train in her Gundog skills for the first sort of 3 years. And when she started having phantom pregnancies, her training got harder. And then after she had puppies, and we sadly lost the puppies, her training got harder. And there have been troughs that I didn't expect in the training. And so it's overcoming those things. But actually, overcoming those things makes you a better handler. If your dog did everything perfectly for life, you would learn very little. And then if your next dog was really difficult, you're going to be in for a bit of a shock. Whereas if your first dog is really hard, you're going to learn a lot.
I can remember with one of my horses, it was when I was young enough to not really know what I was doing. She was the first horse, her name was Tara. She was the first horse where I was aware as a child that I was learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And everybody said to me, oh, she's a push button pony. Like, I'd literally go into a show ring and I would compete in show jumping, and she'd win. She'd literally win. Wherever I took her in, she'd win. And she made me look amazing. And then after, I had a horse called, first one was called Bramble, who was, and I'll use the word, she was a pig. And I hated her. I couldn't get on with her. And months later, Dad sold her and bought me another horse. But I was brought to the awareness very quickly that whilst I had been on top of Tara, I had not been riding Tara. She had been schooling me. She had just literally taken me around, and there was actually nothing to learn from that. So sometimes, while I think it's great and it's fabulous when things are all going perfectly and you can't have anything to complain about, afterwards, the next dog, because there normally is a next dog, if they are a little bit more difficult, you are going to wish the dog before was a little bit harder to teach you that bit more.
Yeah, and I've seen this happen so many times with clients. They'll have their first dog and they get really lucky with that dog and it's super easy to train. And they're like, this dog training malarkey's easy. And then perhaps they decide that actually, because that was easy or because they enjoyed it and it was fun and easy, they might go for a slightly more hotter breed or a slightly more hotter line of the breed, and they get the next dog and they're like, oh, this is so different, and they feel like they've got a wild child. And actually they learn more from that dog. Really, it might be a bit harder, it might feel more challenging, it might take a bit more time, but actually they learn so much more from that dog. And they will really appreciate the first dog as well, because they're like, you were just lovely to train, you were so easy to train. But they will really appreciate the second dog when they get through those challenges, because they've learned so much more. They've been challenged in different ways and learned so much more. And so with that comes a lot of pride when you get there in the end.
I always say to my son, my middle child, always say to him, if you had come first, the rest wouldn't have been here. Because Scarlett was a breeze. Slept through from 3 weeks old. Just a breeze. Never give me a moment's problem. She still doesn't give me a moment's problem. And then he came along and I was like, oh my God. It was like 5 years between them. I did 5 years of perfect, like gold stars galore every day. And then he came along and he went, so you want to be a mother, do you? Which is not. But yeah, he told me loads. And then the third came along, and now I look around and I think, I am better with you because of him. Charlotte taught me a lot, but he taught me a lot more. Certainly about like managing. In funny, and I see this with dogs as well. When you've got a difficult dog, you learn more about managing your own emotion because you have to.
It's very true. You do have to manage your own emotions, and you have to learn not to hold a grudge, and you have to learn not to take it personally. People often take it personally when the dog makes mistakes or when the dog gets things wrong. They take it personally. Oh, he's doing this on purpose. No, your dog. Okay, so the dog might be doing something in the moment on purpose, but it's not on purpose to offend you. It's just the dog being a dog. And through repetition, you have less of that stuff happen. So as the handler, you've got to not take things personally. You've not got to hold a grudge on the dog, because dogs don't hold grudges. And dogs forgive us for so many mistakes that we make in our handling. So we have to give the same back to them in their training.
Yeah, because I'm sure there's many times my dogs look at me and go, look, I know when you were Ed, you know what you're asking me to do, but I've got no clue. So could you make it a little bit clearer, please?
Oh, 100%. And I think the thing is, thank goodness that dogs read body language as well as they do, because sometimes we've all done it. You've given your dog a verbal cue or command alongside a physical cue or command, and the thing that's come out of your mouth is not the thing you meant to say, but the dog got it right because your body language was so good. And so thank goodness the dog can do that, because otherwise it would be very confusing.
To wrap up another amazing podcast episode, looking back on sort of your own experience, what lessons do you think that you've learned that have shaped your approach as an owner and trainer? What are the things that are now like ingrained? I'm sure you've touched on many of them throughout this episode, but what are sort of the fundamentals for you?
Yeah, absolutely, to not hold a grudge and to have a sense of humor when I'm training my dog, to a point, to appreciate whether the dog is in the learning phase or the proofing stage, or whether we are essentially working with a trained response, but remembering that even though it's a trained response, training is for life, so it will occasionally go wrong. Never holding a grudge on the dog when they make a mistake, and having the ability to review what's happened and be really honest to say, okay, am I missing something here? Is there something else going wrong that is creating this that I'm seeing? But also to get an outsider's perspective on it and tell you if they see something, but also videoing myself so that I can see my body language, my dog's body language. Because in the moment when you're there working that dog, you're so close to it, sometimes you can't see it. Does that make sense? So I find that videoing myself or getting somebody else to have a look helps me see the things that I can't see in the moment.
Yeah, and I think when we touched on emotion, but I think when you are wound or frustrated or guilty or upset or all those negative emotions, it's very hard to see what's going on anyway, isn't it? You just, your mind's almost blocked to read in a situation. Whereas when you are calm and you are patient, and we talk about mindful quite a lot now, you're in the moment, it's far easier to see those tiny little things then, because your mind is open to it.
Yeah, being in the moment is so important. You cannot train your dog effectively and efficiently if you're not there in the moment with the dog. You can't be holding on to something else that's going on in your life or stressing and worrying about something. You have to be with the dog in that moment. And if you're not in that right mindset, the best thing you can do is not do that training. Do something that you both enjoy together and connect with your dog.
And to connect that back to where we just started the podcast, when all these things are going on in the home that you may not be aware of, it's probably because you're not mindful. When you're cooking food, you're thinking about food, you're not thinking, where's the dog? So it's just making yourself be a little bit more aware in the training phase so that you've got a chance to put it right at the start.
Absolutely, 100%.
Fabulous. Thank you for another amazing podcast. I'm sure everybody's going to love it. Please, on our social media, pop in your thoughts. We love to hear them. Let us know what topics you want us to cover as well. We've been doing this for nearly 3 years now, and we want to make sure that we cover the topics that are important to you. You can find us at Ladies Working Dog on Instagram or Ladies Working Dog Group on Facebook. You can find our free group, you can find our membership on www.thelwdg.com, and we genuinely do love to hear from you. That's all for now. I hope you've had a fabulous time listening to us, and we shall see you all next week. That's it for today's episode. A massive thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to head over to the LWDG and sign up for our membership. Get access to expert-led training, a wonderfully supportive community, and the resources you need to become a confident and skilled gun dog trainer. Let's take this journey together, because no woman should have to train her gun dog alone. We'll see you all next week.